Hello and welcome to Biblical Preaching 2. I'm Dr. Mewborn, and today we're looking at the topic, distracting habits. This is a great topic because in sermon delivery or the preaching moment, there are times when we might offer something that's distracting to people, and sometimes we don't know that we're doing it. And that's why we always say it's good to practice preaching either in front of a mirror, in front of a camera, record it and look over it, or practice in front of people. A lot of times in the preaching moment, people will share with you, or afterward they'll share with you what they noticed, what they observed, and that will help you to know what you might need to change the next time that you preach. And so let's talk about that today in this lesson entitled Distracting Habits. We remember this model from a previous class where we talk about the interaction model of communication. And simply you have a sender and a receiver, and they are communicating messages. And usually it's the idea the sender at first is the encoding. They're encoding the message. And then it's sent, and then there's a decoding side of it. In the middle of that, of communication process, you're going to have what we call the message. We're going to have some feedback. We're going to have what's known as noise. And then there's going to be the idea of what we see and what we feel and what we hear, and of course our environment is involved in that as well. And so this model is helpful for us, not just a one-on-one conversation with interpersonal kind of conversation, but it's also helpful for us when we're preaching, because the sender in the message, usually known as the preacher, is going to deliver a message. But then you have the congregation who is observing the message and also giving feedback, as we've looked at with previous lessons as well. Now, when we do this, if we're not careful, if the sender is not careful, especially the preacher is not careful, there will be distracting habits that he will offer that can easily distort the message or sometimes counteract the message. In some ways, it's not maybe a hand motion does not align with what's being said, or maybe the facial expressions don't match what's being said, or maybe it's the facial expressions don't match the tone of the message in general, the tone of the text. And so we need to pay attention to this, because we need to do everything we possibly can do to eliminate any distractions that can be a part of the preaching moment. So let's go ahead and talk about the distracting habits when preaching. Number one, turning your back to the audience to read from the screen. A lot of preachers will have a screen that will either have the passage of scripture, it will have notes, it'll have points, maybe it'll have a quote, it could have a picture. There's all types of things that can be used in the audiovisual type of aids. But one of the things we have to be careful about is to consider not turning our back to the audience when we are reading something. At a time, unless we're intentionally doing it to show something, most of the time it's not really what we should do. If we think of a Broadway play, Broadway plays are unique, or any kind of acting is unique, is because you don't want to turn your back to the crowd. There may be some side views you can do. There might be, of course, some front on. There could be some angles that you might be able to use. But typically, we don't want to turn our back because it closes off. It's the congregation can observe that as closing off, and we need to be careful about that. We also know that there's a lot of cameras that can catch us at different angles, so it might look like we're always looking forward based on the cameras, the certain cameras that are catching us in that moment. And that's understandable, and we can use those things. But typically, we don't want to turn our back. And as a best practice, it's best to always face the crowd in some form or fashion. Never turn your shoulders and turn your back completely to the crowd. Number two, using filler words and vocal pauses. We need to be careful with this. Sometimes we add filler words or vocal pauses that don't really belong. They don't match what's going on. Some of those filler words can. Do you understand what I mean? Well, I'm sorry. I just got to explain it this way. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I've heard many preachers or different preachers at times apologize. It was like, I'm sorry multiple times in the message. I'm sorry. This is the way I see it. Now, I'm sorry. This is the way I see it. They'll say that, or they'll say, do you understand what I'm saying? Do you feel my heart here? They'll use those kind of words, which is fine to get people to pay attention. But I think sometimes we can overuse those words, not just the words like and and or the words like. We need to be careful with those in the preaching moment as much as possible. Let us be clear. Let us be concise. Let us be practiced in such a way that we can offer a strong message. That's a good way to put it. Number 3, aimlessly pacing back and forth on the stage. Have you ever seen someone that paces, and it's almost like it's timed in a sense, where they will walk to one side of the stage, stay there for approximately 2 seconds, and then they will begin their journey back to the other side, which could take however long, and then they stay there for 2 seconds, and they start the journey back to the other side. It's almost like watching a tennis match, and we need to be careful with this because it can be distracting if it's not intentional. Occasionally, we will watch people pace so much and it'll be a rocking motion. They almost look as if they're swaying. And it can be distracting because we start feeling, oh, well, here they go that way. Okay, here they go that way. And we need to be careful and pay attention to these things. Best way that you can know if you're doing this is to record one of your sermons. See if you're doing that. Or ask somebody, am I doing this? And they'll be quick to tell you what you're doing. Number 4, constantly adjusting the head-worn microphone or clothing. This is probably one of my struggles, especially wearing certain microphones. Now, we know there's different kind of microphones out there. There's some that you can put on your shirt or lapel or your jacket, maybe a lavalier style of microphone. And those are usually, they work really well. They just they may not be as clear for video. They may not be as clear for an audio aspect of a recording, but they can be easier as long as the coat and the jacket or shirt is not rubbing the microphone and scratching it, and of course giving some kind of annoying sounds or distracting sounds. Now, I kind of like a lavalier mic more than I like the headset mic that's just over one ear. And the reason is because if it doesn't fit just right, a lot of times it can flop downward, or it can turn up, or it can even loosen on your ear, kind of want to fall off. And before you know it, you've got an issue. You're always touching it. You're always trying to fix it. And it can become very distracting to the preacher, and it can equally become distracting to the audience. And so I would take very strong care to whatever microphone is expected in whatever church that you preach in. I would make sure you practice moving around with that microphone on. If you need some tape to tape that to your neck, or if you need some way to secure it a little bit more so it doesn't move, that would be helpful. If you would like a certain kind, ask them if they have a certain kind. I've done that before. Do you have one that goes over both ears and then comes around to your mouth or to the side of your face? Do you have that kind of a countryman style microphone? That would be better in most cases, or a lavalier mic would be better in some cases. But I do think it's important. Now, there's the other side of things, not just the microphone that we might be adjusting and things like that can become very distracting. But our clothing, sometimes adjusting our clothing, adjusting our jacket, our shirt, putting our hands through our hair, adjusting our collar, whatever it might be, it can be extremely distracting if we do it multiple times. Now, I understand you might have to adjust your jacket once or maybe even twice during the message. Maybe there's a collar situation going on, and we understand that. But if it's if it's a pattern and you do it often, let's say 5 to 10 times during a sermon, you might want to try to take care not to do that. You might want to change that and think about that the next time that you preach. Number 5, not fully articulating words or finishing sentences. This is an interesting one because if we go too quickly in our sermons, or if we don't try to articulate very clearly, we will sound almost muffled when we speak, and we will have issues where it sounds like we're almost mumbling. And you definitely don't want to come across in a way that you're mumbling, because that right there can cause people to miss a point or misunderstand what you're actually saying. And you need to do everything that you can to be as clear as possible. And so personally, I work hard to pronounce words correctly. If there's a name of a place or a name of a person in the Bible, I try to look it up and find the best pronunciation, and then I say it consistently the same way throughout the sermon. Then also, when I'm trying to make a strong point, or I'm giving an explanation of something, or I'm saying a point, I will take care to pronounce every word correctly. I will take great care to enunciate well. And it's this idea that separating words to be individual words and not running them together where there is where you can't even spell it correctly because it's maybe a modern day form of English. We need to be careful to articulate well, pronounce our words well, enunciate words well, don't just cram them together, and finish sentences well. That will help us. Number 6, speaking too fast or too slow during the message. At times, if you're not careful, you will speak too slowly. And when you speak too slowly, people get rather bored, or they feel that you're trying to be too contemplative, and maybe you don't know exactly what you're going to say next. Maybe you're kind of working through it. Being too slow can sometimes put people to sleep. It can put people into almost a meditative state. We need to be careful with that. Equally as wrong sometimes is speaking too fast. I don't have an issue speaking too slowly when I am preaching. I get extremely excited. I get very charismatic. I get passionate as I can be. And especially making a strong point, I begin to speed up. And I get going so fast at times that people will say, you've got to slow down after the message. I mean, I can't keep up with taking notes. And so what I'll do is I'll work on that. But what I find is if I feel I have too much information and I feel like it has to come out, all of it has to come out, or the sermon doesn't make sense, then I will ask, how long do I have to preach? And if they say to me, you only have 30 minutes, but really I need a good pace and it's going to take me about 40 minutes to say it, then what I probably would do is I would pull back on some of the illustrations or the length of the illustrations so that I can make sure I get in my points and explanations as much as possible. So speaking too fast can be a struggle because people can't keep up. They can't take notes. Sometimes can't listen that quickly. And then other times it may not be as clear and they might miss something. And you don't want them to miss something. Number 7, being too loud or too quiet during the message. This is a big deal. Sometimes preachers will get excited to the point of almost yelling. And passionate is one thing. But yelling to almost being seen as scolding somebody, and they're sitting there in the church hoping to hear from you or hearing a message from you, that might come across in a terrible way. And you might want to pull back on getting too loud. It can hurt people's ears. It can make people feel like you're scolding them or yelling down at them. And then there's the other side of being too quiet during the message. And it's almost as if it's a whisper. Sometimes that can be effective. Being loud can be effective too. But sometimes being too quiet, too often, or for too long, it can have a negative effect on your preaching. And people are going to say, wow, he's so emotional, or he's so serious, and we need to be careful about this. I don't think it's wrong to be too serious. I think we're dealing with the message of the gospel. But I would say this, if those things can hinder or possibly hinder your message, you might want to stay clear of him. And number 8, speaking with a monotone voice or overly dramatic inflections. Sometimes we can be monotone in what we're saying, as if there's really no feeling in it. We are just automatons, or we're just robotic and just delivering information, not really giving a message. And there's a difference between just delivering or giving information and actually preaching a message. It's very different. Preaching is an emotional thing. Preaching is a passionate thing. Preaching begins in the heart, and it should come from a pleading, just like the scripture we can read of Christ pleading with people and speaking to people, and the disciples doing this and calling them to change their ways and calling them to trust in Christ and follow the Lord. Well, there's something very special about that and exciting about that. And so being monotone almost feels as though the minister does not care. He's just he's getting through the day, and he's just sharing. He's just delivering information, and we don't look like that. On the other side, we don't want to be overly dramatic. What that means is you're acting, you're performing. You're up and down, loud and soft, and you're screaming. Now you're whispering, and you're all over the place. You're playing out this extraordinary performance that just seems that it's not even real. People are looking for someone whose emotions are controlled. They're looking for someone who is consistent in thoughtful in the way that they look at something and they deliver the message. Be convictional, be passionate, but I think we need to be careful to not be overly dramatic where it looks like we're trying out for the next Broadway show. So let's be careful about that as well. I think these are distracting habits. If we're not careful, that can be a part of the preaching moment. Now let's look at some of the different vocal or some of the tics that we can have that we possibly do, that we may or may not know we do, but we can work at it. Number 1, clearing the throat excessively. Sometimes we have allergies, sometimes we have a cold, sometimes we're working through some kind of sinus thing. Maybe we have a cough, and clearing the throat can be overly distracting. If you can keep from doing that, maybe it's preparing before you ever get into the pulpit. Is there some kind of allergy medicine you could take? Is there some kind of cough drop that you could take before you step up to preach? Is there something that can calm that down if you have a medical issue? But sometimes people just do it because it's a habit and they don't know they're doing it. They don't have to do it, but they just do it. Knowing about that would be a very good thing. Then you can change it, and you can actually try to remove that from the sermon delivery. Saying repeatedly can be a vocal tic that we don't know we're always saying, but it's there. And if we're not careful, these phrases, similar phrases like this, can be extremely distracting. You saw that there? Using unnecessary emphasis on certain words. Now, we do this very often if we're not careful. If we're not aware of every sentence we're going to say, or we're not aware of the major points we're going to make, there are times when we can put an unnecessary emphasis on certain words. And we need to be careful about that, because we are delivering a message that has a clear emphasis that we need to draw attention to. And so if we are mistaken here, or if we are misstepping here, we're going to put emphasis where it doesn't need to be. Pitching voice up at the end of sentences as if asking a question. This is another issue that we need to get a hold of. I've known a lot of guys in my life over the years that they had this style of speaking. It was just normal for them to talk this way. And some preachers also use this type of style in the pulpit. And I would caution anyone about this, because if it sounds like you're asking a question, it's similar to saying, you know. It's similar to adding that at the end. You're just pitching your voice up and doing the same thing, just in a different way. You don't want to do that in the pulpit. And here's why. You don't want to come across as if you don't know the answer to what you're actually asking. You're not sure about what you're saying, so therefore you add a question feel to it to make it more accepting to the people. This is something you need to be very careful about doing in your sermons, because if not, it will cause people to doubt your abilities. And you don't want that. You want to make sure that you deliver strong messages, you declare things in the message, and make statements, and that will really help. Now, let's look a little bit at the physical tics, okay? Fidgeting with hands or microphone. These are physical things. We've talked a little bit about that already. Rocking back and forth on feet. We talked about that a little bit already. The pacing, the rocking, the swaying. If you do it too much, people are going to watch and wait and anticipate the next time you're doing it. Touching face or hair frequently. Need to be very careful with this. Sometimes people are looking to see, especially with folks and all, they're super nervous about getting sick, whether it's a cold or whether it's the flu, whatever it might be. People are watching you. If you touch your face, they're wondering, are you going to shake their hand? Some of them are thinking that. Keep your hands away from your face. It's something that my wife says all the time to my little 6-year-old son. Keep your hands away from your face. Keep your hands away from your face. And it was a habit. It was something that my mom told me when I was young. Keep your hands away from your face. Well, when you preach, you've got to know that there's a bunch of moms and dads in the audience who are like, get your hands away from your face. Be careful about that. Constantly adjusting glasses. This is something that most people never think about. They take glasses on and off and on and off. They're reading something. They're looking at the audience. They're reading something. They're looking at the audience. They do it constantly throughout the sermon. And it's extremely distracting. If we're not careful to pay attention to this, there are ways to work around this. But I think adjusting glasses, always pushing them up, always taking them on and off, you got to be careful, because people will pay attention to that. Staring at notes without looking up. This is a true tic for a lot of people. They are married to their notes sometimes that they can't look up. If I look up, I'll lose my place. If I look up, I'll lose where I am, and I can't go off the cuff, and I need to be careful about that. You need to know your sermon so well that it's just on a small maybe one page sheet of paper, and you can put it all on there and just give the highlights, maybe a couple sheets of paper, but not a lot, because we don't want to be staring at our notes. Every time we stare at our notes, it shows that we are not engaged with the people. Now, there are times when we're reading from our notes, there are times we're looking down, but we need to quickly think, I'm looking right back up. Looking down is just to gather your thoughts a lot of times. It's to kind of hone in. Maybe you're reading a long quote and you need to look down and read it. I get that. Maybe you're reading a long passage of scripture, you need to look down and do that. But what I'm saying is that to give explanation of a text, or to give just an illustration that you're saying, or a transition to the next point, or the point itself, we need to be very careful to spend a lot of time looking down on those moments. We need to look at the people. We need to engage the people with our eyes. All right? Verbal tics. Beginning sentences with so or like. This is difficult. The reason this is such a difficult one is because this is the way we talk in our daily conversations. We start sentences out with so. We start things out with like. And we need to be careful to be a little more intentional when we start sentences. Be intentional that we don't overuse a word like. We need to try to pull back from that as much as possible. It will truly improve our preaching if we would do that. Overuse of cliches or phrases. This is a big issue. If we are always using phrases, such in the South, in southern states, there are a lot of cliches. There's a lot of phrases, and they sound fine. But when we overuse them, they lose a little bit of punch. And we need to be careful about that. Don't overuse certain phrases. You might love a certain phrase, but don't overuse it. Using overly complex language that may confuse the audience. We've talked about this so much. Do the best that you can to make sure that the language you speak, is not overly complex. One of my mentors, who was a pastor, he said that preaching to an 8th grade audience is what you should aim for every Sunday morning. Preaching to 8th graders. 8th graders can understand a lot. And so speak to them directly. And if you do that, you're going to be able to meet most people where they are. Now, why are these considered tics? Here's a good question. Distraction from the message. When a preacher exhibits repetitive physical or verbal habits, it can draw the listener's attention away from the content of the sermon and focus on the mannerism instead. Very true. Lack of professionalism. Frequent tics can make a preacher appear unprepared and less credible. That is very true. It's absolutely true in some cases that if we're not careful about these types of tics that we can have, distracting habits, it can easily come across that we're not ready for Sunday. We're not ready for Sunday night. We're not ready for Wednesday. And if that's the case, you'll become less credible. Now, let's talk about how do you address these distracting tics. How to address them. Self-awareness. Be conscious of your mannerisms and actively work to identify any tics you may have. We need to work very hard to make sure we're aware of mannerisms or tics that we may have and actively work to stop them or to push them out of the preaching moment. A lot of times it's going to take practice to do this. It's going to take working through it. If there's something that you do, if you sway back and forth, if you rock when you preach, if you travel left and right, or if you're always touching your face, or if you're adjusting your coat, whatever you're doing, try to be aware that you're doing these things. Listen to what people say. Ask them what they say. Is there anything I'm doing? Be self-aware of that. Another thing that you can do is practice delivery. Rehearse your sermon aloud, paying close attention to your vocal delivery and body language. Practicing the sermon out loud is really going to help you. I do this almost every time that I preach a sermon. I go and preach it in a room where I can hear myself say it out loud. And the reason that this is helpful is because I can hear it being said. I can hear the words being pronounced. Because if I come to a word and I'm not sure how it's pronounced, I will look it up in that moment because I just tried to say it, and I noticed when I tried to say it, it wasn't as clear. Or when I practiced it, it didn't make as much sense as it should have made, or it should make. Number 3, feedback from trusted individuals. Ask a mentor or colleague to provide constructive feedback on your preaching style. This is a big one. Get trusted individuals to come in, not to change you to make you somebody else, but to say, all right, is there anything that I'm doing that I should pull back on? Video recording. Watch a recording of your own sermon to identify areas for improvement. This, for me, was one of the most important things that I ever did as I was coming into my preaching ministry. I remember recording a sermon at my house for preaching class, and watching that sermon was so difficult for me. And the reason it was so difficult for me is because I watched all of these tics that I was doing, these mannerisms that I had, these habits, the patterns of that way I was speaking, and it was very difficult to watch. And I took notes, and I said, I cannot do that again. I cannot do that again. Oh, I didn't know I was doing that. This is terrible. And so you begin to write all this stuff down, and then the next time you're preaching, record yourself again. And you'll see, did you improve some of those? And you'll start noticing you can change things for the next time that you preach. Sometimes you can change things in the moment. And so I think these are helpful ways to address those distracting preaching habits that we can easily have. All right. Well, this has been Distracting Habits. Good to be with you today. This is a very practical lesson, but it's a very helpful one when we think about sermon delivery. It's good to be with you. God bless you, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.